Revolution. The word invokes importance, an epic weight of implied history. These are moments in the grand tale where destiny splits from the ways of the past, and a new direction is available to humanity. Of course, when you dig into the great revolutions, you always find them more limited than you were promised, their gains mixed, their heroes hypocritical. It never lives up to the hype. Which is why we wish to speak today of a revolution that could use more hype. Arguably the most revolutionary revolutions. Let's go on down to Haiti.
Hello, and welcome to No One is Competent, the premier history podcast about, well, whatever we want it to be about. I'm your host, Jay, and today I'm joined as always by my co-host, Azalea. Azalea, how have you been doing as of late?
I turned 25, and they told me that my brain was going to stop developing, and it would settle, and I things would be more quiet, and that has definitely happened. Or maybe I'm just on the downswing of being bipolar. Who knows? No one can say.
So I was going to mention your birthday, but I didn't want to dox you, and then I remembered that you tweeted about it, and also I'm pretty sure my birthday is just on my Twitter, so it doesn't really matter.
I mean, my position has always been, if a person wants to spend the time figuring out where I've been, because I'll say very specific. I don't tell you my address, but I'll say very specific things about where I live and where I'm from, what I've done. If you want to be obsessive and track me down, if you're hot, I might fuck you. If you're not, well, we can fight on my front lawn and you'll lose and it'll be fine. It seems like a low-risk thing, honestly.
Yeah, I suppose that's the case.
Let them come, I say. So, this is, of course, the No One is Competent podcast, brought to you with no ads and no sponsors, besides, of course, the deep state. So, we ask that you please take some time to give us a like, give us a subscribe, give us a rating, a review, stars, whatever you can do on the podcasting platform that you're listening to us on, be that Apple or Spotify or YouTube or Anchor or yada yada on the shada. Diddle that algorithm for us. We'd really appreciate it. Or telling our friends. If you'd like to talk, please reach out to us if you have questions or if you have podcast episode requests to make. Please talk to us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, me at Azalea Wyatt, and my illustrious co-host at Jaharis48. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce, and before you ask, I did that completely without a script because I'm just that good. We're on our 38th episode, people. You think we don't have this down pat by now?
We have some things down pat, not everything.
Jay, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're talking about the Haitian Revolution, or rather the backstory of it, I suppose we should say.
And this is, by my count, part 6 of our French Revolution series. We had the Bourbons and Louis XVI. We had the French Revolution, the War of the First Coalition. We had Napoleon ending the Revolutionary Era. We had the War of the Second Coalition. And now we have to go halfway around the darn world to continue telling the story in Haiti.
Sounds about right, yeah.
Because what goes down here is going to affect everything that we're going to talk about in the future and has been affected by everything we talked about in the past. You see, throughout all of the stories we've been telling of the French Revolution, in many ways a greater story has been boiling. The Haitian Revolution has been building to and then going on throughout all of these episodes, and now we have to tell its tale. In this episode, we'll explain the colony of Saint Domingue and how the French lost control of perhaps the most valuable scrap of land on the planet. You may have heard that the Haitian Revolution is the most successful slave revolt in history, and essentially in this episode we're going to bring you all the way to that slave revolt and see why it happened and why the colony failed. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the fallout of that slave revolt, how the revolution really starts happening, and how all the factions start fighting over the island for the next 10 years. We're then going to go into the implications of the Haitian Revolution and how it affected not only French history, but that of the United States and beyond. So, yes, this is part of the French Revolution series, but these two episodes will somewhat stand on their own. Only at the end of part 2 will we really talk about the greater impact this is going to have on France's trajectory and Napoleon's trajectory. First, we're going to talk about the situation in Haiti, how its leaders lost control, and how the greatest slave revolt in history got started.
Now, our sources for today's episode are A Concise History of the Haitian Revolution by Jeremy D. Popkin and The Haitian Revolution, A Documentary History by David Gegges.
Alright. So there lies within the Caribbean an island which was settled by the Taino people thousands of years ago, eventually settling into several kingdoms. We don't have the best of evidence for what they called the island, but the two best guesses are Quizquela and Haiti, which is obviously now more popular.
Christopher Columbus arrived in December of 1492, and within a few decades he and the Spanish patrons would work the Taino to death in slave camps. They aimed to mine gold in the Caribbean, but a far more profitable venture would soon be found. Columbus named the island Hispania, and English speakers turned into calling that Hispaniola, which is still done today. The Spanish renamed it Santo Domingo. Now, this island, like much of the Caribbean, is far more mountainous than one would assume. Most notably, a chain of mountains running north to south separating the western 40% from the eastern 60% is found on it. The genocide of the Taino resulted in the depopulation of much of Hispaniola, and over the ensuing centuries, the Spanish came to mostly treat the island as little more than a pit stop en route to the wealthy gold and silver-rich colonies of Mexico and Central America. This meant that the bulk of the island's coast, especially along its western and northern reaches, was left essentially unguarded. By the mid-17th century, French settlers began to settle these remote portions of Santo Domingo, establishing a small presence on the island that France would later use as a pretense to lay a claim to it. In 1697, Spain formally ceded the western third of the island to France upon the end of the 9 Years' War. Now, the French will translate Santo Domingo into Saint Domingue. If you're wondering how Santo Domingo becomes Saint Domingue, we remind you that French is a nonsense language practiced by vagabonds without respect for logic, God, or the concept of consonants.
Under the French, Saint Domingue would come into its own as a colony dedicated to using slave labor to produce cash crops. This was the whole point of the colony, what 99% of its industry was dedicated to. Under the dominant logic of 18th century European colonialism, you've heard this in school, this was called mercantilism. The purpose of colonies such as Saint Domingue was to produce as many raw materials as possible to be sent to the home country for consumption. As Saint Domingue lacked significant mineral resources, this raw material would take the form of its soil, its agricultural produce, namely sugar, coffee, and indigo.
Now, the acquisition of Saint Domingue by the French in the late 1600s had coincided with a boom in the sugar production across the Caribbean. Sugarcane had been domesticated around 4000 BC in the East Indies, but for much of its history it remained a niche exotic crop due to the high amount of effort required to harvest and process it. It was not until the rise of European colonialism in the Americas that sugar production would reach a truly massive scale, obviously facilitated by the import of African slaves. Sugar was perpetually in demand, and so valuable in Europe that at the end of the 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century, France was willing to give up the entirety of their North American territory in return for keeping the possession of their Caribbean sugar colonies.
I want you all to think about that. Basically, all of Canada and some parts of what is now the United States. Yeah, fuck it, that's just some frigid woods filled with beavers. Give me the fucking Caribbean beaches where we can grow sugar. Like, Jay, these days, the average American consumes more sugar in a day than a European nobleman would in a month 300 years ago.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
we think of it as so commonplace, as, a thing that's in your pantry. But the human race had to do a lot in order to make sugar a easily accessible thing, and a lot of that was utterly monstrous. We'll get into sugar production later on, but one thing I think a lot of people don't know about is it is not a crop that you can do small scale very well.
No.
Because you need vast furnaces, which at this point in history were fueled by wood, to heat and boil the sugar. You need massive presses, which at this point are done on water wheels next to a creek, to squeeze the sugar cane. So sugar cultivation requires industrialization, mass organization, and terraforming of the world around you. That's essentially the only way to do it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to see on Saint Domingue.
Yeah. In the early decades of the 18th century, Saint Domingue quickly became the center of French sugar production in the Caribbean. Out of France's possessions in the region, which also included Martinique, St. Lucia, and Guadeloupe, Saint Domingue was the largest and most profitable. Sugar would soon be accompanied by another Old World import, coffee. Now, whereas sugarcane was grown in the lowland plains and valleys, coffee could take root in the highlands. The combination of these crops, which would eventually be joined by indigo and cotton, allowed French landowners on the island to exploit their land with brutal effectiveness. By 1789, Saint Domingue produced nearly half of the world's supply of sugar and coffee.
Think about that for a moment. What is now the nation of Haiti was producing like 45 to 50% of the entire world's supply of sugar. That's pretty fucking bonkers.
Yeah.
I mean, what I think about is like this is a patch of land that was ethnically cleansed and then just sort of like abandoned. And when people got there, they were like, well, what's the most profitable thing we can do with this land? Sugar in the lowlands, coffee in the highlands. And they did.
And again, like if you just imagine what it would be like, we take these things for granted, but you can see why, people who've never had sugar in their lives or coffee in their lives would love it and would do anything to get more of it. And that's why there was so much demand in Europe. Because, once you get that in your diet, you're not going back.
I mean, sugar is a substance that your body is essentially brain hacked to want. And coffee is drugs. And people like drugs.
Literally addictive.
Such intense agricultural production was only made possible by vast amounts of slave labor, resulting in a boom in the population of Saint Domingue. In 1687, there were roughly 4,000 white colonists and 3,000 black slaves on the colony. By 1779, the white population had increased to 32,000, while the slave population was near 250,000. And by 1790, the slave population would nearly double to 500,000 slaves. In case you're wondering of the Spanish side of the island, if they were doing this same scale of horror, not really. The Spanish colony of Santo Domingo, where smaller scale farming and livestock ranching dominated, had a total population of just around 100,000 by the late 18th century, with whites and 3 people of mixed European, native, and black ancestry outnumbering the slaves. Their sheer disparity in demographics between the two colonies reveals the type of society needed to fuel Saint Domingue's economy. If there's one thing we can get across to y'all, is that Saint Domingue existed for one purpose and was geared to do one thing and could only exist in one way. It was a project of extraction, of making money above all concerns. But that doesn't mean it didn't have a culture.
Now, it takes about 2 months for ships to reach Saint Domingue from France. Ships come with news every day, but there's always a lag. In turn, there's a 2-month lag of news on Saint Domingue getting to France. This, of course, will cause problems in the future. But in 1789, news of the French Revolution would reach the colonists in Saint Domingue. All could tell that change was in the air, and like everyone else in the French Empire, the people of Saint Domingue had grievances that they wanted addressed.
If you want to know why the French Revolution is happening in 1789, oh boy, do I have some podcast episodes for you!
Now, of course, 2 years later, all these people are going to be shooting at each other. So before they do that, let's meet them and hear their complaints. We'll divide them both on class and racial ground. Obviously, race is going to be very important in the tale of the slave revolt, but we'll ask you to try to suspend your current view of race. The characters of our story did understand themselves as being in different racial categories, but saw things differently than we did, as we'll see soon.
Remember, folks, race is, in many ways, a mental construct, and you can construct it in your head differently. So, sitting at the top of the pyramid were the big whites. These are the owners of the massive slave plantations, and the richest amongst them usually didn't even live on the island. Instead, they paid others to manage their estates and passively collected the income from afar as they lived in France. These guys, many of them are the wealthiest members of French society, who are going to be heavily involved in the first stage of the French Revolution. Now, you'd think that being on top of the economic pyramid, these guys would have no complaints, but bitches be bitches, and humans always want more. There's little difference between these landowners in Saint Domingue and the rich leaders of the American Revolution. They too complained about the mercantile colonialism the French had set up. They too wanted to be able to trade with other colonies like Jamaica and have full representation in whatever new government was to come, perhaps even independence.
Below them were the mid-sized plantation owners, who wouldn't really be notable but for the fact that, well, they weren't actually all white. If you put two groups together, it won't take long for mixed-race babies to show up. That's just a fact of humanity. The first colonists were mostly men, who quickly took slave women as their mistresses and sometimes wives. Despite the doubtlessly sickening nature of these unions, it was not uncommon for white slave owners to free both their mother and the children of these relationships. Sometimes these children were treated as bastards, others as legitimate heirs who took over the father's plantation and ran them just the same. These people interacted with the population in every way men and women could. For example, it was common in the early days of the colony for poor white colonists to marry the mixed-race daughters of white plantation owners and take over part of the plantation.
That was an easy way to get a leg up in society. The free people of color also came to fill other roles in the colony, working in a variety of small businesses and serving as rural policemen, a role which mostly involved hunting down runaway slaves. Now you fast forward this a few generations, and a large chunk of the free population of Saint Domingue were folks who were 1/4, 1/8, or 1/16 African. And they were thought of as a distinct group from black slaves. Some of them even just straight up looked white. Now, the whites saw them as different. Sometimes, some didn't, but some did. The slaves saw them as different, and they certainly saw themselves as different from the slaves. And these colonists of color will be a distinct faction in our story going forward. Most historians these days refer to these people as the Coloreds of Saint Domingue. There are, of course, other historical terms for them, all of which are even less comfortable to use. Being from the American South, I really do not like the term colored, but we will occasionally use that term, or mixed race, when we just want to feel more comfortable, colonists of color. Just know whenever you hear that we're referring to the mixed race inhabitants of Haiti, who are all freedmen and women. And if you research this further and you see sources talking about the colored colonists or colonists of color, they're not talking about the slaves. And it's, again, very, very, very important to distinguish these individuals from the enslaved Africans. So they're living completely separate lives.
Yeah. Yeah, no, these people ran the gamut of caste within Saint Domingue. There were poor colored artisans, barely scraping by in the cities, and there were rich colored plantation owners who had hundreds of slaves and had been educated in France. Often they're found arguing for their class interest rather than along racial lines. There were several notable mixed-race colonists in France during the Revolution advocating to end discrimination, but, keep slavery. Because, people are kind of trash regardless of where they're from or whatever. As for the discrimination, though, what's interesting is that it actually got worse over time. Now, obviously, colored colonists face personal discrimination to varying degrees, but in the early days of Saint Domingue, there were no laws on the books saying that people of color were to be treated differently than whites. At the start of the sugar boom in Saint Domingue, both white indentured servants and black slaves were brought in to work the fields, making the racial dichotomy of the colony a bit less obvious. In time, however, indentured servitude was largely phased out, leaving slaves as the dominant part of the workforce.
However, as we said, not all people of color in Saint Domingue were slaves. As mentioned, the colony quickly came to boost one of the largest populations of free people of color in the Caribbean. Now, the Code Noir was a legal decree issued by King Louis XIV in 1685, regulating slavery in the French Empire, and it specified that free people of color had, quote, the same rights, privileges, and liberties enjoyed by persons born free. While individuals undoubtedly held prejudices against the colored community, this part of the Code Noir, unlike much of the rest of it, was largely respected throughout the early 18th century. One can easily imagine Saint Domingue eventually developing a kind of mixed-race society that was dominant in the neighboring Santo Domingo. But things began to change in the 1760s, with a series of laws passed by the French colonial authorities restricting the legal rights of coloreds. People of color were barred from professions such as medicine and law, banned from taking the family name of their white ancestors, and even banned from wearing high-class clothing and jewelry. The attitude of white colonists also began to shift against the coloreds, as many of the less well-off so-called petits blancs, the little whites, came to resent being seen as below wealthy people of color in the social hierarchy. We've seen this before in history, as whites often end up attacking people of color when they either resent their success or see them as a threat to their own economic prosperity, even if that's a flaw of logic.
Yeah. Now, in general, the people of color, for their part, remained fairly consistent in wanting to be seen as Frenchmen equal to the whites they worked with so closely. For the most part, they did not want to overthrow the social hierarchy, just achieve a higher place in it. This will be important to future events. Now, then there were the poor whites who worked in the cities or oversaw the plantations. They resented the big whites and the wealthy coloreds, as we just mentioned. There was a lot of racial tension between poor whites and poor mixed-race folks as these groups competed for limited jobs, and the last few decades of legal discrimination had only heightened tensions. When the revolution breaks out, all these groups are going to try to get their voices heard at the Estates General and then the General Assembly. Some wanted full independence, others representation, and some were even monarchists. They were a diverse group of competing interests, and all of these people only make up 10% of the colony.
All right. Time to talk about the folks of actual complaints. 90% of the population of Saint Domingue were black slaves. And black will be equivalent to slave or former slave going forward in these two episodes. Now, I think that for a lot of us, our reference in our heads to slavery are the Confederate States of America. The ratio of slave to free in the Confederacy was about 1-to-1 in the early 1860s. Here in Saint Domingue, it is 10 slaves to 1 white. As a side note, that was a very similar ratio of migrant labor to citizens in Qatar about 2 months back, but just to mention a completely unrelated example. Anyway, Europeans began using Africans as slave labor in their colonies after native inhabitants and poor Europeans proved insufficient. This work was so deadly and traumatic that it required its own dedicated labor supply. We're not going to go into details on the slave trade in this period, perhaps another day, but here's just a few of the basics. The rival kingdoms of West Africa had been capturing each other as prisoners of war for centuries, and a sort of slave trade existed long before Europeans, though it is different than how we imagined it. Some people imagined, don't worry if this is you, but you gotta remember, the Europeans did not, go and hunt black folk down in Africa and, capture them with nets and stuff. They bought them from other Africans who did that work of fighting them and defeating them in battle.
Yeah.
But the European demand for slavery was far greater than these kingdoms had encountered before, and it necessitated more war to meet demand, war aided by European guns. Europeans bought the slaves off the Africans and crammed them into ships where they made the Atlantic voyage cramped, starving, thirsty, and covered in filth. Between the conditions on the ship and Caribbean diseases, only half the slaves would even survive the journey. It's hard to even just imagine being in just such a cramped room, and eventually you're in a cramped room with a third to a half corpses.
Yeah.
It's not hard to imagine. I cannot conceptualize.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't think it's possible to really relate to unless you've actually been in a similar situation, which obviously neither of us have, and most people on Earth have not. Thankfully.
Thankfully, thank God. Slave ships arrived regularly on Saint Domingue. Again, it's difficult to convey to modern people how horrific colonial slavery was. But on top of all of that, the slavery in Saint Domingue was the most, or maybe second most, brutal in the world at the time. Even by the standards of New World brutality, Haiti stood out for its sheer inhumanity. The dystopian labor demanded by its sugar and coffee plantations resulted in the average slave surviving less than 4 years on the island.
Constant death demanded a constant stream of new slaves. It also meant that most of the slaves weren't born on the island. Around a third of all slaves important to Saint Domingue died in the first year in the colony, as we just mentioned. In 1790 alone, the colony imported 30,000 slaves. By the time of the start of the Revolution, roughly half of Saint Domingue's slave population was made up of people born in Africa, many of whom just happened to have military experience, because remember, they're prisoners of war, or at least a lot of them are. The slaves that were born in Africa came from a region as large as the eastern seaboard of the United States, They spoke dozens of languages and practiced many different religions. Some may have previously been enemies. Still, they would have to come together.
Alright, here's broadly how slavery worked on the island. About 80% of the slaves were field slaves. So that's like, 70-ish percent of the whole population of the colony. Now, that's men and women were field slaves. The other 20% were house slaves. And house slave just refers to every job that's not in the field. Maids, cooks, stable hands, coachmen, everything that needed to be done in and around the manor. Remember, on the slave plantations, slaves did basically every single job, even jobs that we might refer to as craftsmen or skilled jobs. Only like in the cities were there jobs for free whites and free colonists of color. Now, house slaves were more likely to be island-born, they were more likely to speak French, and they were more likely to have received some sort of an education to do their job. They were also more likely to have face-to-face relationships with their masters. It's easy to see why a large chunk of the slave revolt's leaders will be former house slaves. Now, over half the field slaves worked on sugar plantations. Next was coffee, and after that in percentage was indigo. Of the three main crops, sugar was by far the most brutal and horrific. People can say, what's the worst place and time in history to be? And after you rule out, genocides, places of war, disease outbreaks, and imminent death, natural disasters, sugar plantation might be my statement on the list of the worst place you could be in history.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of around this time period is being a slave in the mines. That's really
Mine's
the
also
only
pretty
thing
bad.
that's just
Silver
just
mine in
about as
Argentina.
bad. Yeah.
When I took a history of colonial Latin America class in college, we had an entire lecture just dedicated to how a sugar plantation worked and why it really fucking sucked. As we're going to go into. Slaves worked in teams, around 4 to 12 guys, all supervised by a driver. The driver's whip could strike at the hint of a slave slowing their pace. On Saint Domingue, the job of driver was one performed by other slaves, and drivers would make up a large percentage of slave leaders come freedom. Men and women both worked the fields, but they generally did separate jobs.
Now, the most brutal time of year came when it was time to harvest the sugar. Sugarcane spoils quickly after being cut, so slaves would work for 4 more days straight without stopping. Cutting the cane could easily slice off the slave's flesh. After being cut, it was hauled off to a press where massive rollers squeezed out the sugar. Those supervising this process kept hatchets on their belts, as stray limbs getting stuck in the rollers was a regular occurrence. The subsequent boiling of the sugar presented almost just as much of a threat as the molten sap would stick to the skin and quickly burn deep into the flesh. Now, all of this was done by exhausted people operating days without sleep, which surely increased injury. Another common way to die on the plantation was to be beaten to death. Lashings were standard punishment, and slaves regularly did not survive. These punishments were often handed out randomly and arbitrarily, based on just trying to instill fear in the slave populations. To the same end, when masters executed slaves, they did so in the most elaborate and creative ways possible. We'll leave most of this up to the imagination, but we have first-hand accounts of everything from dismemberment to detonation.
Again, we try to condense a lot of the horror and whatnot because I don't like to depress, but suffice to say there's plenty of reasons for these people to be mad. Those who try to downplay slavery will point out that the French government published laws on how slaves were to be treated. This is true, and technically masters were not allowed to abuse their property without cause, but these guidelines were largely ignored in the colony, and there wasn't like a dedicated task force to enforcing it. Others will tell you that slaves got days off. This is also very true, but you see, most masters did not feed their slaves. Instead, they gave them small plots of land, and slaves spent their days off growing their food. Slaves sometimes would be able to sell some of these crops and put together enough money to buy their freedom, but these were rare cases, and black freemen were a negligible part of the colony's population.
Now, runaway slaves were called maroons and usually found refuge in the mountains separating the French and Spanish parts of the island. Keep those mountains in mind because they'll be important later on. Slaves told the legends of these heroes in many religious gatherings. And maroons are actually very interesting. I mean, you have maroons pretty much everywhere you have slavery in the Americas. I remember reading in, I think, high school about basically like a colony of maroons in Illinois, people who had escaped from the South and came up to Illinois.
Really?
Early on, in U.S. history.
I had heard about maroons hanging out in the barrier islands of Georgia and South Carolina.
Yeah, that's a big one as well, or in like the Chesapeake areas as well. You know, the basic idea is just hiding in areas which are very inhospitable, swamps and mountains and stuff like that. But yeah. Now, slave culture leaned on religion to bring together so many separate people. Voodoo is something you might have heard of, and this is a concept that will be key throughout Haiti's history, and at this point in history, the term refers to the fusion of African religions with Christianity. These slaves faced inhuman oppression and thus relied on inhuman power in this time of trial. The last big category of leaders in the rebellion will come to be the religious figures.
Okay, that's probably everything you need to know, so let's now look at the battlefield, the geography of Saint Domingue. It's split into 3 provinces by the French: the North, the West, and the South. The 2 largest settlements in the colony were the port towns of Cap Français in the north and Port-au-Prince in the west. From these ports, the produce of Saint Domingue was hauled off to France. And while the imports needed to keep the system going, food, tools, and above all else, slaves streamed in. There are ships coming and leaving to and from France every single day. The South was the area least suited for agriculture, and thus had the lowest population density. On the eve of the French Revolution, the colony had a population of around 556,000 people, consisting of roughly 32,000 whites, 24,000 coloreds, and 500,000 slaves.
As a point of comparison, I think the entire southern United States around this time has 700,000 slaves. So that's 500,000. That's almost as much in a tiny fraction of the amount of territory.
Yeah. Okay, so 1789. What happens?
So in 1789, the members of France's National Assembly were debating every aspect of the old regime. Centuries-old traditions were being dismantled left and right. Obviously, slavery was a part of the debate, as were the status of colored citizens and the nature of the colony itself. How should Saint Domingue be governed? What participation should it be allowed? Should French laws fully apply there? Abolitionism was a minority position, but a vocal one. Our old friend Brissot may have been a blind warmonger, but he was also one of France's most forward advocates for emancipation. The issue of slavery came up several times in the first few months, but was often just kind of kicked down the road. It was easy to talk about right and wrong, but the sheer profits of Saint Domingue were impossible to ignore.
This is going to be a theme that we will return to in these 2 episodes.
Yeah, very much so. Citizens of Saint Domingue wanted to say in these talks, and so many of their wealthy elite went to Paris to plead their case, both white and colored. News of the revolution's many shocking developments made their way back to the colony. Soon an atmosphere of political possibility inflamed the class divisions of Saint Domingue. Everyone knew something was going to change, and everyone knew the implications of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen had for the colony.
I'd also mention that these people are very, very aware of the American Revolution that's happened in the last 2 decades. Some of them fought in it. There were, Saint Domingue colonists of color who fought in the American Revolution as part of the French soldiers. So these ideas of freedom and independence and whatnot, they're very, very primed for them. Representatives of both the white colonists and the free people of color organized themselves into political clubs in Paris to push for their rights and interests. Many whites saw this as a chance to gain greater autonomy for themselves, while others feared that all this talk of freedom and human rights would threaten the racial hierarchy of Saint Domingue. Debate within the National Assembly as to how to treat Saint Domingue remained contentious. In March of 1790, the National Assembly declared that the citizens of the colonies would be allowed to form their own councils to regulate their own affairs, but did not note whether free people of color counted as citizens or not. The white colonists of Saint Domingue naturally interpreted this decree as giving them sole authority over the internal affairs of their colony. The first colonial assembly convened in the city of Saint-Marc, chosen due to its distance from the Royal Army garrisons in Port-au-Prince and Cap Français, in April 1790. Now, this was an all-white assembly, and it passed a decree giving itself the right to pass laws concerning the internal affairs of Saint Domingue. The white colonists also formed their own National Guard unit, similar to those in France. While many members of the National Assembly in Paris initially saw this move as an attempt by the colonists to break away from France, they ultimately gave their approval to the assembly. So, there's a white, self-declared government in Saint-Marc, and this is separate from the previous, colonial governor and French garrison and whatnot that had existed in Cap Français. The Saint-Marc Assembly, however, was not able to resolve tensions within the colony, as resentment from both royalists and free people of color who were being excluded from it bubbled up. The royal garrison briefly disbanded the assembly, and colored militias began to form across the colony. People are starting to grab guns.
In 1791, tensions escalated to violence, mostly between white and colored militias. Much of the violence was done by private actors, with the law not being evenly enforced or enforced at all. As tempers flared, some groups even threatened to free and arm slaves to form an army and take over the colony. The most significant of these early insurrections was that which was led by Vincent Ogé, a free person of color. A wealthy merchant, Ogé had been in Paris at the start of the revolution and returned to Saint Domingue, expecting that he and other people of color would now be able to participate in the governance of the islands. Upon learning that the white colonists were excluding the coloreds from their assembly, he formed his own militia in the northern province of the colony. Now, Ogé failed to attract more than a few hundred followers, which meant that his force was quickly defeated. A separate colored militia raised in the south by André Rigaud would prove much more successful, and Rigaud would go on to play a prominent role in the events of the revolution.
Yeah, hang on to that name. It's worth noting that Ogé, when he was captured and executed, was executed in an incredibly brutal way, basically fully dismembered on a wheel. And it was a way you would execute a runaway slave, which was lost on absolutely no one in the colony. News of Ogé's uprising and death sparked a round of fierce debates in Paris. Those sympathetic to his cause viewed him as a French citizen who was simply fighting for his rights, while the white colonists highlighted the danger his kind posed to France's most profitable colony. The colonists even demanded that the new French constitution should guarantee the right to own slaves in the colonies, prompting Robespierre to declare that it would be better to, quote, let the colonies perish than mention the word slavery in the constitution of a free country. In response, the Assembly voted initially to affirm the rights of free persons of color as citizens, enraging the white colonists, before then reversing course and denying the rights of free persons of color just a few months later. Remember, the First National Assembly is not the best, most decisive institutions. And meanwhile, slowly but surely, political violence is being normalized in Saint Domingue. And this is building, and it's building, and it's building. And then in August of 1791, the slaves showed up and were like, hey, sorry to interrupt all of this, but, fuck all y'all!
On August 14th of 1791, the slaves in the north of the colony rebelled. This was not a random burst of rebellion. The slaves had been planning for weeks, possibly months, mostly during religious rituals. A leader of these initial religious meetings was a voodoo preacher and rebel named Duddy Boukman. And many of the precise details about Boukman's rebellion are lost to history. No written records were taken of the planning of it, and even the most basic details about Boukman's own life are a matter of debate. What is known is that on August 14th of 1791, a group of slaves met secretly on a plantation in northern Saint Domingue to plan a rebellion. Why they acted when they did is a mystery, but it is possible that they had witnessed in some way the growing disunity between the whites and coloreds, or the growing sense of unrest by whites against the French government.
I've heard tell that there was a rumor that the King of France had freed them going around. I've heard ideas that they had just been planning stuff for months or years and just thought now this is the time. I kind of lean more towards that. There's very little documentation, Jay, I'm sure you can attest, of this early phase.
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly taking notes of their meetings, and there are also like more mystical stories of the voodoo rituals and of storms coming in, telling them that like it's the time to make their move and stuff like that.
Boukman actively claims to have supernatural powers, and as his warriors are going to topple a hierarchy of caste and start breaking chains, it's very logical for them to believe that their leader has supernatural powers.
Yeah. And most of these slaves were commandeurs and coachmen. These are the people who have the ability and experience to coordinate large groups of people. Their plot was put in jeopardy a few days later, though, when one slave privy to it acted early and set fire to a building on the plantation. This arsonist was captured and interrogated, but even though he confessed the details of the scheme, the authorities didn't take him seriously, as they thought slaves were incapable of such kinds of organization.
Classic.
Yeah. A few days later, Boukman's followers put their plan into action. They stormed the mansions of the plantation managers, killed several whites, and set fire to the buildings and the fields before moving on to neighboring estates. The movement quickly grew in size, they're just going from estate to estate doing this, and more slaves are flocking to it, with each estate. Now, Boukman's rebels were far from an organized or trained force. Most of them would have been armed with the same kinds of tools that they had used for their work, machetes, sickles, and the like, though they likely did capture some firearms. The rapid outbreak of this uprising, however, sent the whites into a state of sheer panic.
Years of pent-up abuse inside each slave leapt forth to seek catharsis. There was violence, as there always is in these situations, and that violence was heavily dependent on the choices of the individuals. We have first-hand accounts of masters being butchered en masse, with women and children. We have accounts of rebel slaves hiding a favored master from the wrath of others and helping a sympathetic family to safety. In general, the only constant to the violence was arson. Slaves torched everything they get their hands on, which is quite easy on a sugar plantation. The stuff burns. They attacked not only the masters who enslaved them, but also the industry that they had toiled under. Soon the skies of northern Saint Domingue were dyed black with smoke and orange with flame. The citizens of Cap Francais got to watch this hell approach them as more and more plantations fell to liberation. They did not take to it well. Racial violence will be a theme throughout the story. I mean, it already is. And driven by fear and paranoia, the citizens of the city began killing and dismembering slaves basically at random.
And in addition to this, remember, few white colonists believed that the slaves were actually capable of organizing and leading an uprising against their masters. As a result, many of them suspected that the free coloreds were behind all of this, and therefore several free persons of color were lynched in Cap Francais. Others accused the royalist governor. As panic set in, many managers in the northern provinces fled their estates, and by October, the rebels had near complete control over the eastern half of that province. Almost simultaneous to Boukman's uprising was an insurrection of a different kind in the West Province, this one led by free persons of color. On August 7th, a group of colored delegates from across the West and South met in Mirabelais to form their own assembly as a response to their exclusion from politics. These men, who included the militia leader André Rigaud and his close associates Alexandre Pétion and Jean-Paul Boyer, both of whom would become future rulers of Haiti, did not speak of ending slavery, but instead sought the recognition of their rights as free citizens. Now in this, they even received the support of some white landowners who viewed cooperation with the coloreds as a way of maintaining the hierarchy on the colony. By October, the colored forces, having raised armies of black slaves nicknamed the Swiss after the Swiss mercenaries of Europe, had captured Port-au-Prince.
So, to recap, we've got a massive slave rebellion happening in the north, threatening Cap Francais, and we have a army led by militia leaders of color with the backing of some whites that have armed slaves that have captured Port-au-Prince. So we now have at least 3 factions. Yeah. If you can call the slaves a single faction, because they're not fully organized. And we mentioned Boukman, but they have several leaders.
Yeah. Now, you can arguably say that the French aren't even a single faction at this moment, because you still have a royalist governor and garrison that doesn't fully a lot of the colonists and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that Saint Domingue shatters. It's easy to shatter when you have this many factions and people, and the government control is incredibly light, because the whole point of this place is to just extract wealth from these farms.
Yeah.
While these simultaneous uprisings caused a wave of panic throughout much of white society on the island, they did not amount to an immediate overthrow of white authority. By November, the slave rebellion in the north had been contained, and Boukman had been killed in battle. Still, a large portion of the countryside was now under the control of black and colored forces, which are, again, not necessarily aligned. In late 1791, negotiations began between white authorities and the leaders of various uprisings in an attempt to bring about an end to the conflict. These negotiations were encouraged by the arrival of the First Civil Commission, a delegation sent by the revolutionary government in France for the purpose of restoring order in Saint Domingue. Remember, 2-month lag! So when the slave revolt breaks out in August, Paris ain't hearing about it till October, and their representatives can't get there until December. So They're trying. It's just, this is the best they can do.
Yeah.
In the north, Jean-Francois and Georges Bissot, who had taken charge of the uprising after the death of Boukman, had begun to reach out to the white colonists for some kind of settlement. These are slave leaders saying, all right, come on, let's talk. And acting as an important aide and advisor to these leaders was a man by the name of Toussaint Louverture. And if there is any name that you remember out of this episode, it's that, Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint, and if you see it spelled, it's Toussint, Toussaint, was born in 1743 in Saint Domingue as a slave. So he is in his late 30s at this point. Growing up, he had the relative fortune of working in domestic roles, such as a coachman. Mike Duncan kind of describes him as basically winning the slave lottery in his Revolution series. By 1776, Toussaint had been freed from slavery and had spent the following years working in a variety of trades, briefly owning at least one slave himself, before returning to work for his old master, paid. Toussaint's role in the earliest stages of the rebellion is a bit of a mystery. He had been a leader coordinating several slaves and planning a rebellion. I believe it's at least true, because we don't know how much he was involved in the early days, but he and his people did not rebel on day one when everything started.
Yeah.
And I believe it's that he kind of waited just a week or two just to see if this thing was actually gonna work before he was like, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
But so he's not one of the initial leaders, but he very quickly becomes an important lieutenant, very educated, very knowledgeable, and smart as whip to the principal leaders. Whatever the case may be, Toussaint's education, provided to him by his godfather or Jesuit missionaries, and acute political ability made him a valuable asset.
Now, Jean-Francois and Bissot offered to put down their arms in exchange for the freedom of the leaders of the uprising. Most notably, the bulk of the actual slaves who had risen up would be made to return to their work as slaves, though without any sort of punishment.
This is always wild to me.
Yeah.
I'm mostly sure that the slave, that they're not being told that. This isn't a secret meeting. You try and fault these guys, but they assume that France is going to come over and crush them, that things are going to get worse, there's no way they can hold out, because they're being realistic. And so they want to meet in the smoke-filled room, and as soon as the door closes, say, all right, what's your offer? We're bringing a lot to the table. I got a lot of chips. Let's talk.
Yeah, they're not thinking, at least these guys are not thinking in terms of revolution just yet, as we think of it.
Or building a nation state.
Yeah. Now, this offer is shot down by the whites, because the whites also think that the rebellion is just going to be crushed pretty soon. Just got to wait for some new French soldiers to arrive on the island, and then everything will be fine. In the West, negotiations between the colored leaders and the white colonists were a little bit more fruitful, but only for a short period of time. You see, after capturing Port-au-Prince, the colored leaders came to an agreement with the whites that saw the whites recognize the rights of, free men of color in exchange for the disarmament of their formerly enslaved black soldiers. The bulk of these soldiers, the so-called Swiss, were subsequently massacred by the white colonists, and the deal soon fell apart as infighting between the whites and colored militias quickly resumed in the city. In hindsight, it's quite clear that any kind of negotiated settlement was very unlikely to occur in 1791. However, the failed negotiations do provide insight into the thoughts of the various factions involved. They show how the idea of the rebellion as an anti-slavery revolution had yet to be really articulated by the rebels themselves. The bulk of the former slaves who had taken up arms did so out of a desire for freedom, but their leaders, both colored and former slaves alike, were not yet proposing an end to slavery as an institution. This also shows us the degree to which white colonists were unwilling to cooperate even with the free men of color in the island, which, could have maintained a stratified society had they just been willing to sit down and play ball.
Yeah, like the ratio of white to colored is like 60-40-ish. There are a lot of people. They could really help you out.
Yeah.
But you're just like, nah, we're going to win. Of course we're going to win. How can we not win? This is the way things work. Now, 1792 would see a series of events in Europe that greatly affected the course of the rebellion. The mostly pro-colonial National Assembly was replaced by the Legislative Assembly, in which Jacques-Pierre Brissot, the leader of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, played a leading role. Brissot agreed to send more troops to Saint Domingue, but only under the condition that free men of color be granted full rights as citizens of France. The force of around 6,000 soldiers would be accompanied by a second civil commission, led by the Jacobin activists Etienne Polverel and Leger Félicité Sonthonax. George R.R. Martin-ass name, Sonthonax.
Great name.
Great fucking name. Of course, 1792 would also see the outbreak of the War of the First Coalition, which is almost going to be as nuts as the war that is about to break out on Haiti in our next episode of No One is Competent. So this is where we stand. We have the North, a lot of it loosely controlled chaos of various slave armies, some of which are negotiating with the whites. That's not really going anywhere. We have Port-au-Prince in the south, which has devolved into fighting of white and color militias. And we have a new contingent of French soldiers led by two dudes who are surely going to sort all this out by a government that is totally legitimate, is going to keep its legitimacy, and totally isn't about to be overthrown.
Definitely not.
And all in the background, we have this guy, Toussaint Louverture, whispering in some ears of a few of the slave leaders. As we got some time, we can do just a little analysis. It is fascinating how immediately fractured this place becomes. And I think that makes sense considering how much of it is just rural farmland. Like, there's 2 or 3 cities, even those aren't that big. The population density here is weird. Like, it's distributed, but where it's distributed, again, it's because it's farms, so it's all slaves. So the population distribution of free people is totally off, right?
Yeah.
And this makes the place super easy to chop up.
Yeah, this is a place where, even though it's a small area, it's a place where, getting from the north to the south, it's quite a trek. It takes some effort if you're going overland.
Because there aren't serious roads to do that, because all of the roads are set up to take stuff from the plantations to the direct nearest port, not to connect this place and infrastructure that would logically facilitate human movement.
Yeah.
This is colonial infrastructure textbook.
Yeah, it's for extraction. It's not for, domestic development. And also, the white society on the island it falls apart just like the white society in France is falling apart. Mm-hmm. Except that on Saint Domingue, you have this white society which has, competing interests, royalists versus people who support the revolution. But that's on top of their disagreements with the coloreds, who have their own divisions. And that's all on top of the black slave population.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah. It's a whole degree of mess. And, early on, it seems almost quaint that like some of these whites are being like, thinking that the main fight or the main conflict or main debate's going to be like royalist versus revolutionary. We'll see this will be subsumed very quickly by events. But, that was a serious thing, that like a serious conflict that was going on top of everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like we mentioned it multiple times, but just like the sheer imbalance of demographics in Saint Domingue, like this is abnormal by European colonial standards. This is, lopsided compared to the American South or like Brazil or stuff like that,
mm-hmm.
which are massive slave societies.
I think you always have to say when you mention the Confederacy and Brazil, and you mention, say, Haiti is the most successful slave revolt, is that all of the other slave colonies, like, quintupled their security after this shit.
Yeah.
It got harder to run away. It got harder to revolt. It got harder to organize. In the South, they specifically tried to ban black-only church services because they knew that's where they would plan it. That's where they were talking.
Yeah. There is a degree to which, they're incredibly cruel, the white, masters on Saint Domingue.
Like, they used everything around them. From the bugs, to the plants, to the horses, to the livestock, to the wheels. They used everything. Use your imagination in how they executed people. I promise you they did it.
But there's a degree, and I suppose this is another incompetency, of like, they're kind of lax. Like we mentioned, like they just didn't think that slaves were capable of mass organization.
There's not a lot of like colonial soldiers.
Yeah.
Like the militia is a volunteer slapshod arrangement, very very semi-formal.
Yeah, and places like the Confederacy and Brazil will not make this mistake.
I mean, I think about how religion has always been a refuge for oppressed peoples as a religious person myself. And I think about how, we didn't mention, but generally they'll say that most of these slaves spoke what is called Creole, which is now more of a formalized term. But again, much like voodoo, back then, voodoo is Catholicism plus African religions. Creole is French, just plus various African languages, which these people all had to speak because a lot of them didn't speak the same languages where they were from. And you have people who, again, most of them have only been on the island for 1 to 3 years, coming together to do this shit. I mean, the ones who planned it who had been around for much longer, but barely speaking the same language. They find a language to speak together. They find a god to worship together. And they go out and they get freedom. And I think it's an incredibly beautiful thing. Next episode, we're going to talk about, we'll see the formations of the governments of Haiti and how they constructed government. But, this is true revolution, if there ever was one, in this someone's quote-unquote revolutionary period. This is the of underclasses rising up, and it's a song that should be sung. We might talk about this more in the next episode, but I'll just sort of maybe mention it here, considering we got a little bit of time. But obviously, Haiti has been in the news on and off for the past, say, 4 to 6 months.
Yeah.
And for very good reason. I mean, their president was assassinated, and a rush hour movie ass way. Shenanigans going on. And things are quite bad in Haiti right now, though. It's controlled by gangs. It's like there's no difference between the gangs of Haiti and, like, say, the warlords of ancient China or something. It's just power devolves to local strongmen. That's how it always works. But when you read about Haiti's poverty, when you read about them, quote, needing help, when you read about the, maybe later we'll get into the, quote, debts they owe the rest of the world, just remember that when philosophers and Enlightenment scholars were throwing around equality, fraternity, liberty, these are the people who actually did it.
Yeah.
Couldn't read, couldn't write, barely knew each other, had their languages taken from them, their religion taken from them, their bodily autonomy taken from them. They're the ones who did it.
Yeah. And again, like, I'm sure we'll probably cover this again next week, or next episode. But when you hear on the news about, the poverty in Haiti, it's important to remember, like, this is a society which, for lack of a better term, should not have existed the way that exists. This is not natural.
Yes, it's the only way to, and that's one thing I think we tried to point out is that this was a very strange system. That's why it fell apart. You have, again, a 10-to-1 slave-free ratio. Like this is not a thing. This is not a good idea. Anyone can tell you this is not a good idea.
Yeah.
This colony had only been around for like 80 to 100-ish years. It didn't have a ton of institutions. It was only for extraction, and it was never going to go well. And things are obviously, Jake can tell you about all of the wars and then the various conflicts of other nations that Haiti's going to go through. But regardless of how that turned out, it was never going to have a good, quote, starting position on the game of civilization.
Yeah, and people will be like, especially I think like Americans, because American history isn't that old, will be like, oh, well, it was hundreds of years ago. Like, really, that's no excuse. And this is not to excuse some of the terrible Haitian leaders in the Haitian history, but
there have been.
Yeah, but that's not that long ago. The events in American history of this time period are with us today. The creation of the Constitution is around this time, and that defines how our government works to this day. Like, the stuff that happens in the late 1700s is hugely important, and what happened, like all these just terrible things that exist in Haiti, exist in Saint Domingue in the 1700s. Like, their effects are with Haiti to this day.
Fuck it, we haven't even hit 90 minutes yet. Basically, the TLDR on Haiti after the Revolutionary period is that France and the rest of the world imposes a trade embargo on them. They do a lot of trading with Latin America and whatnot. They help out a lot of Latin American revolutionary leaders when their wars are going down in the next 30 years and change. But the quote West, the whites, are going to lock them out. And they're going to lock them out until Haiti agrees to pay back the debt it owes to France for all of the stuff it stole. This essentially traps Haiti in a cycle of debt to eventually France, Germany, and the United States. Now, famously, in 1914, France and Germany will go to war, and while they're distracted, the United States will say, time to call in some debt. This leads to, as I love mentioning because I think it's wild, U.S. Marines straight up robbing the Bank of Haiti, the United States occupying the country, breaking up their Congress at gunpoint, essentially forcing all Haitians to vote for a new constitution, a vote taken with U.S. Marines with rifles standing next to the ballot box, so you can guess how that went. And this sort of went on and on with Haiti being kept weak, not allowed to enter the international community of trade. And as it was isolated and extracted, it was taken over by strong men in a country that didn't have a lot of resources, didn't have a lot of education. And it was more or less kept in this bubble, in this cycle of enforced poverty, of debt that is unjust by every glance of sanity, and with more and more being stripped out of the system, more and more people having to leave because it's violent or disease ridden, more and more damage to be being done, more and more not being able to solidly grow and lay a foundation until we reach this point. It's obviously more complicated than I laid it out, but that's the gist of what happened to Haiti. Jay, you have anything to add?
No, I think that about sums it up.
All right, so this has been No One is Competent. We will return to finish the Haitian Revolution and show how the French, the colonists, the French again, the English, the Spanish, all get their ass kicked by the Haitians. And then Napoleon throws his hat in the ring, only to get his ass kicked too. It's going to be a great time. Tune in next time. Email us if you want to contact us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. Remember to rate, review, give us a subscribe on YouTube. You can also ask us questions in the comments there. We have visuals on the YouTube video that will kind of bring this to light for you. Some maps if you didn't fully visualize thing. I have been Azalea. That is Jay. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce. And as he plays us out, y'all be good.